To talk about the ongoing partial government shutdown, the crisis along the southern border, and how we can resolve this matter in a responsible way. We're now on day 28 of the government shutdown, and I'm more discouraged now than I've been during this entire impasse. We're better than this. We're stuck. 800,000 workers have missed a paycheck, and there's no end in sight. NASA workers in Cleveland, TSA employees at our airports across Ohio, Coast Guard officers on Lake Erie, they've all contacted me, as have others. But the harm being done to these families and these workers isn't the only thing that's happening with the shutdown. I've been through 5 of these shutdowns since I worked in the White House for the first President Bush. And I remember in 1990 when we had a weekend shutdown, everybody thought that was dramatic. Here we are with the longest shutdown in our history. I don't like government shutdowns. I don't think they're good for taxpayers. We always end up paying more as taxpayers, every shutdown. I don't think anybody likes them, at least not anybody outside the Beltway. Some in both parties seem to like to use shutdowns, but they're not good for families who are affected. They're not good for the economy. They cost the taxpayers more. On the economy, we now have a report from the Council of Economic Advisors who tell us this week that the shutdown is going to reduce quarterly economic growth by 0.13% for every week it lasts. In other words, every week the shutdown continues, the economy is hurt more. We've got a great economy right now. Thanks to the tax cuts and the regulatory relief and other things that this Congress has done, we've got these record levels of employment, more people employed than ever in our history. We have historically low unemployment. We're bringing people out of the shadows back into work, off the sidelines. There's a lot of positive out there, but this has taken us the wrong way. It's partly the impact on federal employees because their purchasing power is less. We're told that of the $312 billion for fiscal year 2019 that hasn't been appropriated by this Congress, and that's what the shutdown is. It's about 25% of government is not being funded. That's hundreds of millions of dollars each workday that's not going out to federal employees. So part of the economic impact is people have less spending power. But part of it is contractors, a lot of them small businesses who are not getting paid, and so it has an impact on the economy in that way. And again, what happens in the end is that everybody gets paid back, but in the meantime, services are disrupted. It's really inefficient way to run government, and taxpayers end up spending more, not less. So I'm not big on shutdowns, having lived through 5 of them. But I got to say, I've never been more frustrated than with this shutdown. And I'm frustrated for a very simple reason. The solution is right before us. The reasons that we're in this shutdown is because both sides are unwilling to sit down and talk. That makes this shutdown particularly stupid. And the issue before us is what to do with regard to border security, where, in fact, there's a lot of agreement. Border security is one where we don't have these fundamental disagreements, as we might on, let's say, tax cuts or health care policy. This is about whether we should be securing our southern border. And I think my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, when pressed, will say, yeah, of course we should. And when you look at the specifics, we're just not that far apart. So that's what's most frustrating to me about this one, is that we can bring people together and achieve a result here. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what that might mean. I have been working with some colleagues, including the presiding officer, on trying to figure out a way forward. We haven't been successful yet. But there are plenty of folks who want to get to yes in this chamber. And we've got to figure out a way to provide a forum to do that, to make it happen. I'm not here today on the floor to assign blame, to point fingers. There are plenty of people doing that, and that's easy to do because there's lots of blame to go all around. But I am here to talk about how to find that common ground. Of course we have to do more to secure our southern border. I consider it a crisis. Some of my colleagues say it's not a crisis. Some say it is a crisis. Forget the words. We have a problem on the southern border. Here's some of the data. During October and November last year, Customs and Border Protection agents apprehended more than 100,000 people trying to enter the country illegally. This is nearly double the number from the same months in 2017. So the most recent data we have, October and November, just a couple months ago, double the number of people apprehended between the ports of entry as we had the year before. And the big increase is families and kids. This is a very tough issue. According to the Department of Homeland Security, there's been a 50% increase in the number of families coming across the border illegally, and a 25% increase in the number of unaccompanied children. Along with that, there's been a 2,000% increase in asylum claims over the last 5 years. A 2,000% increase in asylum claims over the last 5 years. The largest growth is coming, as we know, from 3 Central American countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. While 9 out of 10 of these claims are ultimately rejected by the immigration courts, the applicants have long since been released into the interior of the United States. That's a problem. We should all be working on that. How do we address this problem? There are some constructive ideas on both sides of the aisle as to how to deal with that. But it's a real problem. In fiscal year 2018, Customs and Border Protection referred nearly 50,000 unaccompanied minors, almost all of whom came across our southern border to seek asylum, to the Department of Health and Human Services for care. I've done a lot of work on this issue in the subcommittee on the Homeland Security Committee, called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and found out about some of the care these kids have gotten and some of the trauma these kids have gone through. HHS is currently housing more than 11,000 of these children. Many have experienced violence, as I say, and serious trauma on their journey to the United States and need significant help. Furthermore, the Drug Enforcement Agency has reported, and I quote, "The southwest border remains the primary entry point for heroin into the United States," end quote. There's no disagreement about that. I'm told that 90% of the heroin that we're experiencing in our communities here comes across the southern border. Fentanyl comes primarily from China. We've made some progress there because it comes primarily through the post office from China. We just passed legislation to deal with that. Fentanyl is the most powerful drug out there, 50 times more powerful than heroin on average, causing most of the overdoses in my state of Ohio and around the country. Well, guess what? More and more of that fentanyl is coming across the southern border. Last year, seizures of fentanyl, a synthetic heroin, again, that is causing all these deaths and overdoses, increased by 135% last year compared to 2017. Part of what's happening is it comes from China to Mexico and then from Mexico into the United States, we're told by law enforcement. And then over the last year, we've seen these scientists in Mexico, evil scientists in Mexico, cook up in these super labs crystal meth, methamphetamines, crystal meth, pure crystal meth that's coming into our communities. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've been at 3 meetings where I bring together the people on the drug abuse task forces of different parts of our state. And I've talked a lot about the opioid crisis, where I've spent a lot of time and effort. And what they tell me is we're making progress on opioids, finally. Thank God. The first time really in 7 years. But guess what the new scourge is? Crystal meth. More pure than ever, more powerful than ever. So that's coming from where? It's coming from Mexico. 135% increase, we've talked about, from fentanyl. We've also seen a 38% increase in methamphetamine trafficking across the southern border just from 2017 to 2018. So this drug issue is a big deal as well. We need to do more. And by the way, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle agree with that. They'd like to see more funding immediately for better screening at ports of entry, as an example, because most of these drugs come in through cars and trucks that cross our border. Well, we've been paying attention to this China issue with fentanyl. What's happening in our southern border continues with very little interdiction on our part. I met with the Customs and Border Protection Commissioner last month in my office. I asked him, how many of these drugs are you intercepting? And he had to acknowledge we don't know, of course, but very few, very few. They need better equipment. They need better technology. They need more people. So I don't think these numbers are sustainable. The number of families, the number of children coming, the number of asylum claims, the number of drugs coming across our border, not sustainable for our Border Patrol, for our judicial system, for our education and health systems, for our communities. And because of all these problems, we need a broad solution at the border. Experts tell us that our solution should include more physical barriers, which the President talks about a lot, but also more border control agents, more technology, more surveillance, more drones, more cameras, more screening at our ports of entry, more technology there to stop this illegal flow of drugs. There was a time when all this wasn't all that controversial. In 2006, Congress enacted on a bipartisan basis legislation called the Secure Fence Act. You've probably heard about it. It authorized 700 miles of additional fencing or physical barriers along the border. Then Senator Barack Obama voted for the Secure Fence Act. Then Senator Hillary Clinton voted for the Secure Fence Act. And then Senator Chuck Schumer voted for this bill. It passed by 80 to 19, an overwhelming bipartisan approval. As recently as 2013, all of the Senate Democrats and 2 independents voted for a broader immigration reform plan that called for no fewer than 700 miles of border fencing. That measure ultimately failed in the House. But let me repeat, every single Democrat in the Senate at the time voted for that bill. Who was the bill's lead sponsor? Senator Chuck Schumer, the minority leader. So asking for additional barriers and fencing along the border as part of a broader strategy to make it more secure shouldn't be that controversial. Is it the only answer? No, it's not. Having said all that, when you remove the partisan politics and the political symbolism, I continue to believe we're not that far apart. If you look at the January 6th letter that the Trump administration sent to the Congress saying, please fund these priorities, you'll see that the response to what's happening along our border that they're proposing is not that far from where we are here in the Congress. Yes, it asks for more barriers. I would think from hearing, frankly, from both sides, from the administration and from the Democrats in Congress, that it would be a wall across 2,000 miles of the border. It's not. That's not the proposal. The proposal is, and I'm reading from it, 234 miles of new barriers and fencing. Not 2,000 miles, 234 miles of additional barriers of some kind. And as you know, the President has now made clear he's prepared to construct these barriers not as a cement wall, but as a fence, what he calls a steel barrier. The White House also made clear in their submission that these barriers would be constructed in a manner consistent with the existing language in the Senate committee-passed bipartisan Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. That means the definition of the border barrier that Republicans and Democrats have long voted for would be the definition used for the construction of these new barriers. So it's $5.7 billion in funding for the construction of additional physical barriers along the southern border, consistent with what the experts say we ought to use, both in terms of the type of barrier and where the barrier ought to be. Again, based on the 2006 law, more than 500 miles of fencing have already been built in California, in Arizona, and in New Mexico. And based on the data, the actual data, they are making a difference. If you talk to folks in those communities and you talk to Customs and Border Protection, they like having those barriers. At a minimum, it slows people down and keeps vehicles from going across some of that desert landscape. So this is part of a broader strategy that's primarily used now in California, Arizona, and New Mexico. The 2006 law resulted in 105 miles of fencing in California, 211 miles in Arizona, 107 miles in a sector that spans Arizona and California. 166 miles of fencing in a sector that spans New Mexico and Texas, though most of this is in New Mexico. And in Texas, in total, there is less than 100 miles of fencing. Now, this is where the priority is now for the Border Patrol, is Texas. Why? Because Texas is 1,200 miles of the 2,000-mile border, and yet they only have 100 miles of barriers. So the new fencing that the administration has requested, as we understand it, is particularly necessary in the most populated parts of the Rio Grande Valley on the Texas-Mexico border. By the way, that's where 40% of the crossings occur. So you would think it makes sense to have more barriers there. Again, it's not all about barriers. It has to be an all-of-the-above strategy. The $5.7 million in barriers, which is about $4 billion more than the bipartisan Senate Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, is what they are proposing. So it's about $4 billion more, 4.1, I think, to be exact, than what's in the bill that's already been agreed to on a bipartisan basis. In December, Democrats proposed $1.3 billion for the same purpose, which is actually a reduction in the amount they initially proposed in November, the month before, of $1.6 billion. But folks, there's a way to find common ground here, especially if you include with this 234 miles of additional barriers, to be determined by the experts as to what kind of barrier and where it goes, if you include with that other immigration policies that many on the other side of the aisle strongly support. And some of us do too, like dealing with DACA. This has been talked about and it's become a political football. Let's resolve it. These are young people who came here as children through no fault of their own. Their family brought them here as kids. They were minors. They're not responsible for breaking immigration laws. And now they're young people. Some of them are working, some of them are in school, some of them are in our military. They're looking for some certainty. I think Congress can provide that. As part of an overall package here, I think it makes sense to include something on DACA. And by the way, a lot of Democrats who have talked about this over the years strongly agree with that. The President has also asked, in addition to looking at DACA, that in the context of overall immigration reform, that we would look at this issue of temporary protected status, or TPS. This is something that many Democrats feel very strongly about. TPS allows the government to provide protection for individuals who come from particularly trouble-stricken countries. There are now 10 countries on that list, and the Secretary of Homeland Security has the ability to provide harbor for those individuals from those 10 countries. Sometimes it's because of a natural disaster, sometimes it's because of a war, sometimes it's because of violence in those countries. They simply have to present themselves at ports of entry and begin the application process, and they go through a legal process to apply. Some of these temporary visas that these individuals under TPS currently have are expiring. And again, there are a lot of senators, particularly on the other side of the aisle, who feel strongly about this. Senator Kaine has been a champion for these individuals. There are tens of thousands of them in his state of Virginia. Senators would like to see some immediate relief there. I think that could be part of a mix here. The President has also requested $675 million to help stop drug smuggling at our ports of entry, $211 million to hire another 750 Border Patrol agents, $800 million for humanitarian needs to fund enhanced medical support, transportation, and temporary facilities for those who are detained at our border. The Homeland Security Appropriation Bill already includes funding for all those purposes, but the President's required additional funds to help deal with this influx we talked about, more families, more unaccompanied children in particular. He's also requested $563 million for 75 additional immigration judges and support staff so that we can help reduce the nearly 800,000 case backlog of pending immigration cases. Again, a lot of Democrats and Republicans, including me, have talked about the need for this. This backlog is part of our problem because people are typically in the communities, and many of them don't show up for their court cases. Part of the problem is the backlog, the amount of time it takes, months. That can be reduced. And finally, the President has requested an additional $631 million for counter-narcotics and weapons technology. Again, this is one that I feel strongly about. I know a lot of my colleagues do. Senator Schumer has talked eloquently about this in the past, needing better screening at ports of entry to try to stop some of these drugs from coming in. I believe these are reasonable requests. Where there is disagreement, let's have a debate over it, and let's come to a compromise. But we have to have a real adult conversation for that to occur. The irony for me is that for those of us who support a stronger presence on the southern border, this shutdown is hurting our efforts to secure the border and to make our immigration system work better. First, U.S. Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protection officers are continuing to work without pay. We want to increase the morale of those brave officers along the border. Hard to increase morale when they're working without pay. More than 40,000 immigration hearings have been canceled. Think about that. 40,000 immigration hearings have already been canceled, contributing to this backlog that already totals 800,000 cases. E-Verify, the government system used to verify the immigration status of workers to determine whether they are illegal or not, to allow employers to reject people who are not legally in this country. That E-Verify system, which is incredibly important because ultimately those jobs are the magnet, right? That's what's pulling people across the border more than anything else. That system is shut down because the government is shut down, that part of government, meaning employers across the United States are unable to effectively know who is legal or not. That doesn't help us with regard to the border. For all these reasons, we need to come together and negotiate a solution. We're not that far apart. Last week, out of frustration that no progress was being made, my colleague Jerry Moran of Kansas and I introduced legislation that would establish a $25 billion border trust fund over the next 5 years to enhance border security across the board, all the things we've talked about. The legislation would also codify protections for the DACA population we talked about. Again, very important to so many in this chamber, particularly on the other side of the aisle. In my view, this is a fair and reasonable solution for all sides, and I believe it could get the necessary votes if it were brought to the floor. But others have better ideas, I'm sure. Let's hear them. Let's have a negotiation on all these issues. But let's get to a resolution. It's been reported in the media that I have been working with Senator Graham, Senator Collins, Senator Alexander, Senator Murkowski, Senator Gardner, and others, along with Senator Coons, Senator Kaine, Senator Cardin, Senator Manchin, and others. This has been in the press. I'm not reporting anything to you today that's not already known. It has been said that we are trying to figure out a way forward, and we are. Democrats have insisted that there can't be a negotiation until the government shutdown is ended. So a bunch of us have said, well, what if we do this? One, let's get a commitment from Democrats that they will seriously negotiate based on the president's request. I think it's a reasonable request. Having received that commitment, then let's have a short-term cessation here of the shutdown. Maybe for a few weeks, maybe for a couple weeks, to give us the space and the time to be able to work out an agreement. There is a substantial number of members from our side and the other side who have agreed to sign a letter along those lines. I'm hopeful that can provide at least one opportunity to move forward. It's the only one I see right now. But if there's a better idea, I'm eager to hear it. And I know my colleagues are too, and more importantly, I know the people I represent are, both those who are directly impacted and those who are watching and saying, why can't Washington get its act together? This makes no sense. Yes, we should provide additional security to our southern border. Why can't we agree to that? We're not that far apart. And why can't we end the government shutdown in the process and allow the normal operations to go back into place so that families, government workers are not put in this position where working paycheck to paycheck, they now don't have a paycheck, and where taxpayers can get the services they've paid for and not end up paying after the fact more money, which is what typically happens in these shutdowns. By the way, I do hope that we can stop using government shutdowns altogether. I don't like them, as I said, and last week I introduced legislation along with 8 of my Republican colleagues that's called the End Government Shutdowns Act. It's pretty straightforward. I've introduced it every single Congress since I was elected in 2010. What it says is if you get to the end of the process and the appropriation bill is not funded by Congress, and our fiscal year end is September 30th, so we've been living since then on these continuing resolutions. But if you end up with not getting the appropriation bill done, or if you get to the end of a continuing resolution and there is no resolution, you have this impasse, instead of having the government shut down, what you do is you just continue the spending from the previous year. And then after 120 days, you reduce it by 1%. And then after another 90 days, you reduce it by another 1%. Why? To give Congress the incentive to get their act together and to actually fund the government appropriately, to pass these appropriations bills, which should provide not just funding, but reforms to government programs. That's the idea. We should every year be looking at all of the government and saying what's working, what's not working, what are we going to fund more, what are we going to fund less, what are we going to eliminate, what are we going to create, something new and good for our country and our constituents. So that's what we want to incentivize by the End Government Shutdowns Act. I would hope that members on both sides of the aisle could support this, and that looking forward, we would not have government shutdowns. We wouldn't be in this mess today if that legislation were law. Bottom line is, we have the opportunity before us to reach a fair agreement. Both sides are going to have to move some. The President is going to have to negotiate, and he says he will. The Speaker of the House is going to have to move some. According to news reports, Speaker Pelosi flat out told the President she would not support $1 for any new barriers. Even if the government were reopened and everything that she asked for was granted. That's not serious. That's not the way to have a successful negotiation, especially when Democrats, as I laid out earlier, have long supported more barriers and fencing along the southern border. So let's act in good faith. Let's move forward to a responsible resolution. That means, yeah, we reopen government, but we also secure the southern border. We're not that far apart. We just need to have the will to get it done.